In this video, we talk about one of my favorite topics, harmonic functionality. In the tonal music of the common practice era, again, that's roughly Bach to Brahms, harmonies will have specific functions. This is different than modal music of previous eras in the medieval and the Renaissance, and the atonal music of the modernist era. In tonal music, harmonies progress in ritualized patterns based largely on root motion, the motion from one chord's root to another chord's root. In modal music, harmonies are created by the linear motion of voices, controlled by directed motion to modal finals, the home pitch of the mode. Meanwhile, in atonal music, composers create their own ritualized patterns, sometimes referencing tonal or modal systems, but not ruled by them, instead creating different patterns of their own. Let's talk about some basic functions that we'll see in this tonal functional system. There are many ways to discuss harmonic functionality, but most of them refer to these three basic functions. Chords with tonic functions that tend to be the most stable, chords with predominant functions, which tend to feel like they are preparing something, and chords with dominant functions, which tend to feel like they are unstable and require resolution. Now we can visualize these three types by thinking of a circle of thirds. We'll have various circles of different models. We'll also talk about a circle of fifths shortly. And we're going to add in the thirds and the chords in a moment, so don't worry about that too much right now. Right now, focus on the fact that the general idea here is that we're going to be moving from tonic to predominant to dominant, and then back around to tonic in a big cycle. Note that I do include a space here for a hybrid chord. Don't worry about that just yet. We'll be getting to that, but in general what we have is tonic moving to predominant, moving to dominant. So we're going to start with our one chord. We can fill in this chart by creating a circle of thirds. In other words, each chord is a third lower than the one before. So we could start with 1, either in major or minor. Major is in the circle, minor is inside the circle, but it works the same either way. That we then go down to 6, then down to 4, then down to 2, then down to 7, then down to 5, and then we see that we've almost completed the circle of thirds. We're going to get to that hybrid chord in just a second. So in this circle of thirds, what we see is, first of all, in the minor mode, we're using the harmonic minor. So if we were in D minor, we'd be going minor 1 to major 6, minor 4, 2 diminished, 7 diminished, 5 to 1. Now we can also do the same thing in the major mode. 1 to 6 to 4 to 2 to 7 to 5 to 1. Essentially, as we move around the circle, we can move to any chord we want as long as we move clockwise. So we could jump around. We could jump from 1 to 6. That's just a move of one space. And then we could jump to 2. And that would be fine. I bet you want to hear 5 next. And then back to 1. We could also move 4 to 7 to 5. And I bet you want to hear 1 there. Now, those are idiomatic progressions, progressions that work well in this style. Idiom is just another word for style. Here, we have some non-idiomatic progressions, some progressions that are less common and less indicative of the common practice era type tonality. And these are created whenever we move counterclockwise along this cycle. So if we're moving backwards from these arrows that are indicated. So for instance, we could have 7 diminished moving to 4. Again, if we're in D major, we sound like that. And if we have 7 diminished moving to 4, it sounds a little bit funky. It doesn't seem quite as directed. Or if we went 5 to 2 to 6, we are in in D major. Here's 5, then to 2, then to 6. That's starting to sound more like modal music to me than it is that directed tonality that we're used to in the music of Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Clara Schumann, folks like that. Sometimes non-idiomatic progressions will appear in certain circumstances, but mostly we'll want to use this idiomatic harmonic motion. As we move back to the beginning of the circle, there are some special rules and exceptions. Dominant class chords tend to always want to resolve to tonic class chords. So once we get all the way from tonic and we make our way to the dominant, those dominant chords want to resolve to 1. 5 and 7 move equally well to 1. Here's 5 to 1, and here's 7 to 1. Both sound great. Now, 5 has a special rule, and it can move to 6 in what is called a deceptive progression. 5, here's 5 going to 6. However, 7 doesn't move to 6 very often. That would sound like this. It sounds unfulfilling. It sounds more like we've arrived on a 1 chord but hit a wrong note. Or that we've moved outside the common practice era and are now freely adding notes like we might in an improvisatory jazz-like context. Let's take a second to look at that last chord in this circle, that hybrid chord that I talked about. In this case, it's the 3 chord. As we see here, chords that have roots a third apart tend to have similar functions. The 3 chord is a third apart from 1 and 5, which have very different functions. They're on 2 different ends of the tonal spectrum, with the tonic being extraordinarily stable and the dominant being very unstable. Thus, 3 is very ambiguous. It's caught between the 2. Ambiguity is just a word that means one thing that can mean 2 different things. Now, ambiguity can be great and powerful in art, but it can also be confusing. 3 is an ambiguous chord, being a hybrid. It's halfway between tonic and dominant. Sometimes we will see the 3 acting as a dominant class chord, especially if we're in the minor mode. So if we have a 3 chord in the minor mode, so F, A, C, and then we have it appear with a raised leading tone, then it really has that dominant function and wants to resolve to 1, especially if it happens to be in first inversion, because then scale degree 5 would be in the bass. We'll also see it act in a few other ways, which we'll discuss momentarily. So in major, the 3 chord is going to be minor. In minor, it's either going to be major or augmented if we choose to use the leading tone, which if it's going to 1, we almost always see it used that way. Now, I want to introduce another model that you might encounter. I teach it this way too, and I also find it useful to think about. The circle of thirds model I think is very intuitive, but I think this is just another way to understand the harmonic flow. It means exactly the same thing, but it's more, in some ways, more and less linear. But let's dive into it, and you can use whichever model helps you understand it the best. So another way to visualize harmonic functionality is by using the closing progression from the circle of fifths. Whereas the circle of thirds was made by falling by third, the circle of fifths is made by descending root motion. You might recognize this as a sequence. So here we have in major 1, 4, 7, and 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. And in minor, we also have 1, 4, 7, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. Works works perfectly fine either way, though note in minor we do use the harmonic minor form for those last several chords. So it's those last three chords that we're most interested in. 2, 5, and 1. Because those are going to be those strongest parts of that progression. So we've taken those chords, those last three chords from the circle of fifths, and placed them in the upper spaces under their function. So you can think of this upper row as just repeating over and over. Tonic, predominant, dominant. Tonic, predominant, dominant. It can go on and on and on as long as you want. So we're just taking essentially a snippet of it here. So these form the strongest cadential progression of the era. 2, 5, 1. Now, I'm sure you've learned 4, 5, 1 as a very strong progression. What we often find is that 2, 5, 1 is maybe just a little bit stronger, meaning that composers frequently use it perhaps a little more often at the very ends of pieces to lend some extra oomph to the final cadence. So just as in the circle of thirds, tonic class chords can move anywhere, predominant class chords like to move to dominant class chords, and dominant class chords like to move back to tonic class chords. So tonic can go anywhere, predominants like to go on to dominant, and dominant likes to go to tonic. As we discovered in the circle of thirds visualization, chords that are a third apart tend to share the same function. So what we're going to do is we're going to place those shared function chords in the second row. The chords in the top row are the primary exemplars of the class of chord, and the chords in the bottom row are subordinate. So 1 is, in this system, the tonic chord. Meanwhile, 6 is a good substitute for it. Same thing with predominant. 2 is the one to use, and 4 is a good substitute. In dominant, 5 is the big one, 7 is the substitute. Now, this doesn't mean they don't sound good and you can't use them equally well. It just means that in terms of creating a super strong cadential progression, 2, 5, 1 is the way to end a piece, but other colors can be used in there to spice things up. Now let's talk about moving within a class. When we move within a chord class, the chords like to progress upwards. So they like to move up in the world. For instance, 4 moving to 2, or in minor, minor 4 moving to 2 diminished, or 7 diminished moving to 5. Here's D major. Here's 4 moving to 2. And then 5 to 1. That sounds great. Now, if we move 2 to 5, if we went backwards, it's not going to sound quite as strong. We do hear it every once in a while, but it's not as frequent. That 2 to 4 starts to sound like modal music to me. It's a different flavor. Again, it's not bad, it's just not idiomatic in the common practice era. Same thing with 7 moving to 5. Sounds perfectly fine. Now if we downgrade it and we move 5 to 7, it's fine. It doesn't have that same strength to it. Now, I remember in a composition lesson when I was an undergrad, I did actually have a piece. It was a C minor ragtime piece. And I remember moving from the 5 chord to a 7 diminished chord. And my teacher said, that shouldn't work, but it does in this context. In that case, first of all, it was a slightly different style. And also in the minor mode, if you're moving from 5-7 to 7 diminished, it almost is like you're intensifying it, because it's almost like you're creating a 5-9 chord. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Just a little sprinkling of coming attractions. So let's talk about the only exception to this is the tonic class. 6 doesn't typically like to move to 1. Here's D major again. Here's a 6 chord, going back to 1. It's not bad, but it certainly seems more like a plagal cadence, or something that you'd use at the end of a piece. Or something that sounds almost a little bit more romantic, or like repertoire from late 19th century Russia. Those sorts of systems that aren't exactly working within the tonal system, which is, again, fine, but it's just not the idiom we're studying right now. Now, when we move between classes, we tend to move towards the right. When doing so, we can move either to the first row or the second row. Either one doesn't matter. We just like moving to the right. Here, the only exception is 7, which typically only moves to 1 and not to 6. So 6 can move to 4, or it can move to 2. That's fine. 4 can move to 7, or it can move to 5. That's fine and no problem. 7 can move to 1, but most of the time, it doesn't like to move to 6. So let's add in the 3 chord now. As we found before, 3 has a harder time fitting in because of its hybrid, ambiguous functionality. Here are a few more details on the function of the 3 chord and how we see it interacting in this style. First of all, it works well when followed by 6. If we remember the circle of fifths progression, and we notice that it moves 3 to 6 when we get to the middle, 1 to 4 to 7 to 3 to 6. So that works fine. Likewise, if used in a circle of fifths patterns, it can sometimes move to 7 diminished. Oftentimes, we'll see it be followed by a 4 chord, especially if one or both of those are in first inversion. The voice leading just works out really, really well there. So here we might have something like this. 3, 6, 4, 6, 2, 5, 1. That works fine. And like I mentioned before, sometimes we'll see it moving to 1 as it does pick up some shared dominant functionality from the pitches that it has with the 5 chord. So we see it moving to 6, we see it moving to 7, interacting with 7 in the circle of fifths, and we see it sometimes moving to the 4 chord. Note that all of these rules still apply when we go to the minor mode. Here I have it now in the minor mode, so we have 1 to 2 diminished to 5 to 1. All of this still applies. We're going to throw in a couple extra rules now with the minor mode. Most of these have to do with whether the leading tone is raised or not. Again, there's added ambiguity and added rules in the minor mode. So, when flat 7 or major 7 appears, it is usually occurring in a circle of fifths pattern. So we should note that if we're using flat 7, it's usually going to interact with 3 and it will be part of that pattern. 1 to 4 to flat 7 to 3 to 6 to 2 to 5 to 1. Likewise, when 3 is following 7, it's usually because of a circle of fifths pattern. 3 still likes to move to 6 in this mode. And we'll still sometimes see major 3 going to minor 4, but it's a little bit less common than it was in major. And again, if 3 is progressing to 1, it's typically augmented in this style. Again, major 3 to 1 feels a little bit more like late 19th century music, particularly from Eastern Europe or Russia. Just a little bit about plagal motion. Sometimes we'll see predominant class chords moving to the tonic. This is what is referred to as plagal motion. We typically see this as 4 moving to 1, or minor 4 moving to minor 1 in minor, and this is referred to as a plagal cadence if it ends a section. However, we'll see that other predominant chords like to move to 1 as well. Here we are in D major again. So if we have 4 moving to 1, it's that amen cadence, that plagal cadence. Occasionally, we can have other predominant class chords like 2 moving to 1, or 2 diminished. That becomes very popular in the Romantic era. That's very nice indeed. So to recap, in the tonal music of the common practice era, again roughly Bach to Brahms, harmonies have specific functions. These functions are traditionally considered to be tonic, predominant, and dominant functions, with tonic function chords moving anywhere, predominant chords typically moving to the dominant, and when they don't, they move to the tonic as part of PLAGAL motion, and dominant class chords build up the tension so that we want to move back to our tonic class chords.